Welcome to the 2019 Nurses Day at the Legislature, Compassion, Advocacy, Responsibility, and Empowerment. This is Patricia Moulton with the North Dakota Center for Nursing, and joining me today is Kristen Rohrs, who is the former Vice President of Government Relations from the North Dakota Nurses Association and a newly elected Senator for our North Dakota Legislature. This presentation was developed by our Nurses Day at the Legislature Committee. Nurses Day at the Legislature is developed by a planning committee that is part of the North Dakota Center for Nursing leadership team. This committee is always growing, and we always invite additional leadership team members and those that are interested in helping to plan the event. Today on our webinar, we will provide a review on how a bill becomes a law, legislative committees and structure, parts of our government and tracking, and we will also be taking a tour of the North Dakota State Legislative website and our advocacy website. Kristen Rohrs will be talking about testifying and advocacy, examples of previous bills, rules of associations, and then we'll provide a brief overview of Nurses Day at the Legislature and registration. So laws can be made a couple of different ways. They can be made by elected officials through the legislative branch, and usually they are ideas by citizens or by legislators that are then sponsored and run through our legislative session, or certainly laws can also be made by a vote of the people through referendums, initiatives, etc. The medical marijuana measure and several of the initiatives on our recent vote would be examples of this. In the picture is actually Representative Karen Rohr. She is a nurse practitioner from the Bismarck area, and she's been in the legislature for several years. So to talk for a moment on how a bill becomes a law. First, a bill has to be passed by the legislature, which is divided into two different chambers, the House and the Senate. The bill then must be signed by the governor's office through the executive branch. Without a signature, the bill doesn't become law. The governor may veto the law and send it back to the legislature unsigned. This actually happened several times in the last session. The governor vetoed sections or even a couple of words of some of the bills that we were tracking. If the governor vetoes a bill, the bill can still be made into law if both chambers of the legislature vote a supermajority of 2/3 to override the governor's veto. The power to sign veto legislation is one of the most significant tools at the disposal of the governor in promoting their agenda. And it's also a significant tool for the legislatures because the legislators have to work closely with the governor in order to make sure that the bills that they are working on will not eventually be vetoed by the governor. Once the bill is passed and is signed by the governor, it is then implemented. Some laws go into effect immediately. Those bills have an emergency clause that allows it to become effective the day the governor signs the bill, but most bills are passed and go into effect on August 1st. The exception to this are appropriations and revenue bills, which typically go into effect on July 1st, which is the beginning of the fiscal year. The executive branch is charged with executing and implementing the laws passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And the various executive agencies may be assigned responsibilities in implementing and enforcing the law. So for instance, if a bill includes a change to the Nurse Practices Act, the Board of Nursing actually is involved in figuring out how to implement it. A lot of times bills and laws are very brief. For example, there is a sentence in the Nurse Practices Act that talks about that the Board of Nursing should have an education loan program, but that is all that it says. And so it was up to the Board of Nursing to actually develop rules and procedures for this. And what happens after that is they develop these rules, which are called administrative rules, and they have a public hearing and a public process. The Attorney General reviews it to make sure it adheres to the Constitution and is legal, and then it goes back to the Administrative Rules Committee, which is made up of legislators who then check to make sure that the rules don't overstep the law that they passed. But is it really this simple? Well, yes and no. The system works, but there's a whole lot that goes behind the scenes. There's a lot of activity with different political parties, different lobbyists and interest parties, and with the different levels of government. And this is why the North Dakota Center for Nursing has a tracking system and leadership team. As a matter of fact, our vision when we started in 2011 is to provide a unified voice for nursing excellence. And so what we we want to achieve and what we have been working to achieve is that all the nursing community works together to get legislation passed and to make sure that legislation is what we want it to be as a nursing community. So as far as steps in the bill process, it starts really with the idea. The idea could come from the legislator, or it can come from the public, or a citizen, somebody from an interested citizen, or during an intern committee meeting. And at that point, the Legislative Council would prepare the bill for a legislator who would sponsor it. That sponsoring are usually more than one sponsor. As a matter of fact, if you're trying to get a bill passed, it's actually advantageous to have a sponsor from the Democratic and Republican Party on both the House and Senate. And then the bill is sponsored by the legislator, is introduced at the legislative session. They have a reading of the bill. There's a committee assignment introduction where the presiding officer of that part of either the House or the Senate refers the bill to the proper committee. The committee is actually then tasked with what I would call the investigation of the bill. The bill is explained, discussed, there's a public hearing, the committee debates and talks about it, and then the committee comes back to the House or Senate with their recommendation. Since there is a little bit over around 1,000 bills at each session, not every legislator can go through and look into detail on every single bill. So they really rely a lot on the committee to provide to do that and provide the recommendation and provide their information. By and large, a lot of legislators do follow the committee recommendation unless it's a highly controversial one, and or it's something that a particular party through their caucus have already decided which way they're going to vote. So they could go back with an amendment or without an amendment from the committee. And then once it comes out of the committee, it is placed on the calendar for final passage. If there's an amendment, they have to adapt or reject that amendment before they can actually put it on the calendar for the final passage. There's a second reading, and then once it passes that side, it then has to cross over to the other side. So if it starts in the House, it has to cross over to the Senate side. Same deal, that gets announced and introduced, goes to a committee, and then they also provide a recommendation, and that side then votes. But what happens a lot of times is that the same bill is not passed on both sides of the House and the Senate. In those cases, a conference committee is appointed. It's 3 people from each side. They discuss the bill, make recommendations to both houses, and then both houses then have to approve the same bill in the exact same form. At this point, that bill is then enrolled and signed by the officers and sent to the governor. Bills that don't require a conference committee, the same thing happens. They're enrolled, signed by the presiding officers, and sent to the governor. And then the governor can sign it or veto it. This slide is really a nice diagram that's actually available on the legislative website. It reminds me a bit of Schoolhouse Rock back in the 80s, but it really outlines the steps I just talked about. But an important part of this is really where the public input is. The public, you can't go and testify during the floor sessions. You really need to testify during that public hearing. That is really your opportunity to do that. Other than public testifying during the public hearings, you can also email, phone, or certainly send a mail letter or drop it off with your legislator in Bismarck if there's a particular bill that you are tracking. But it's really important to make sure that you do utilize that public input to help impact that bill at the correct time. So what is the point of committees? I already kind of talked about how they had a lot of bills and that bills go through a lot of changes, and certainly that committee has been designated by the legislature to do the heavy lifting on those bills. Sometimes there are even typos or simple changes in the language. The North Dakota Nurse Practitioner Association has worked for the last few sessions on making sure that the language in all of the Century Code and the bills that come forward are updated according to their Practices Act change, which was about 6 years ago, which allowed them to have plenary practice. So consequently, anytime the word doctor or physician comes up, if it's appropriate, the language needs to be changed to primary care provider to include physicians or nurse practitioners or whatever they need to do to make sure that it adheres to that particular part of the code and the change. This is also a time for, like I mentioned, more intense deliberation. They'll have a public hearing And then they will also have a working session on it at some point later, sometimes a couple weeks later after the public hearing. But that's really a time for the committee to really dive into that particular bill and really decide what changes they want to make and to really weigh the for and the against testimony that they received. Sometimes they'll also have a second hearing if they didn't feel like everyone was heard or if they want to find out more information. So there are different committees for the House and Senate. For instance, there is a House Human Services Committee and a Senate Human Services Committee because they have to work on the bills for their particular side and then cross it over. There are intercommittees that meet in between the general legislative session, and they're composed of House and Senate members, and their purpose is largely educational. They usually conduct studies based on topics that the legislature was stuck on at the last session. So here's the standing committees on both sides. The biggest difference really is the House has many different appropriations committees. The Senate has one, and the House split their appropriations into like an overall appropriations committee, and then they have an education environmental division, a government operations, a human resources division. So they have several appropriations committee. They are a larger body of representatives, so certainly there's a lot more people to split out into other committees, and they have a few other differences. So what is the role? I kind of talked about that too. They hold public hearings, they have people provide testimony, they discuss the merits of the legislation, problems, overall impact, they propose amendments, and then they vote on a recommended action within the committee, and then the committee itself reports out to the floor what their recommendation is. Once the committee process is completed, the legislation is reported back to the respective chamber. Individual committees cannot kill bills or resolutions. All legislation, all bills must be considered by committees, and they will have a vote on the floor of the respective chamber. Of course, if a bill fails in either side, it does not go to the other side. It's effectively dead at that point. In Minnesota, they actually don't have that rule, so they can actually have bills sit on their agenda for 3 sessions, and then it will go away. So they don't actually have to act on a bill. Often both chambers of the legislature will pass similar but not identical legislation. They might be mostly the same but have different wording, but they do have to pass identical legislation. A lot of times the legislation by the two houses may be actually virtually opposites of each other. Often this is possible if the Republicans control one side and Democrats control the other side. However, that is not the case in North Dakota, as we have had a Republican-controlled House and Senate for a number of years. But certainly each side might have their different ideas. For instance, the medical marijuana bill that passed last session, there was quite a bit of difference between the two sides, and then the conference committee got together to hash out their differences. So as I just mentioned, the legislation must be identical in both sides and passed by both chambers. If this does not happen, a conference committee is appointed that is composed of 6 members, 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate. The leader of each side actually appoints those committee members, and that is where party can sometimes play a role. And I will say they can also reappoint members. So there was a couple of instances last session where the chair of the Senate or the House was not happy with how those conference committee members were doing their job, and he replaced them. So they are worked together, and they're charged with merging common elements of the different pieces of legislation and developing a compromise that is acceptable by the House and Senate floors, and then it is voted on again. So North Dakota has 3 branches of government that serves as check and balances, just like the federal government. So the legislative branch includes the House and Senate, like we've been discussing. There's 94 representatives on the House and 47 senators, and they're all elected by North Dakota voters. The second branch is the executive branch, and of course that's led by the governor and lieutenant governor, and there are several individuals on the executive branch that are elected, such as the Secretary of State, State Treasurer, but it also is composed of all the state agencies, the North Dakota Department of Health, the Agriculture Department, and also all the licensure boards all fall under the governor in the executive branch as well. The third branch of the state government is the judicial branch. And of course, this is the various courts leading up to the North Dakota Supreme Court. The Supreme Court serves as a check and balance for the state executive branch and for the legislative branch, and they can overturn laws. In a particularly interesting case, last session, the governor vetoed several words and items from several bills of the legislature, and the legislature decided to sue the governor over those vetoes. The case was brought up to the North Dakota Supreme Court, who did rule on it. So they serve as that third branch and that third check. On the next slide, I will bring you on a tour of the North Dakota State Legislature website. But the site includes many resources for the session, including finding your legislators and looking at their biography. In fact, they even list what committees and what bills they have sponsored in the past. You can look at the Century Code, administrative rules. You can search for a bill and where the actions and video are located. And you could also sign up for the legislative bill tracking system and for the legislative app to track during the session. This is the Legislative Branch website. On it you will find a lot of information for the upcoming session. For example, under Legislative Assembly, you click here or over here to the 66th Assembly, and you'll get the 2019 information. There isn't a lot on here yet because they haven't organized yet for the session, but you'll see the legislative deadlines, information about the orientation and organizational session they will have for legislators, and then all the committees will be here, bill information, etc. will all be on this website. To give you an example of what will be there when it's live, here's last session's website, and so on here they have for the regular session, they have session information, membership, who's on what committee, hearing schedules, the House calendar, so each day they post what will be on the House floor session and the Senate floor session. They have conference hearing schedules posted here. They have all the bills and resolutions, sponsors, etc. The other item that you might find useful is the video feed section. Of course, there aren't any videos right now, but during the actual session, you can actually click on a particular day. I believe I can go back to the 60... Well, let me do that right now. But you can click on that day, and they live stream the floor sessions in the Senate and House, and they also record them, so you can get them here. The other way to get floor recordings and more information is to actually search by bill. So there'll be a section search by bill number. Right now there are bills from last session, so let's go take a look at one. I'm going to take a look at the higher education budget bill because we tracked a lot on that one. And so you'll see there's an action section. And so you'll see that this is the bill text for when it was introduced, each of the changes and then their marked up versions, and then the final enrollment for the bill. There's also on other bills, there's a fiscal note, but this whole bill is a fiscal note, really. It's a budget bill. You can also click on the video link, and if you'd like, you can actually still go view video for when it was on the Senate and House floor. For instance, here's Senator Holmberg talking about the bill on February 21st. And so you can look at all the different versions and all the video and what they had to say about the bill during the entire session. And you can also during the session too, and not just afterwards. Also for a legislative assembly, you can search for legislators under each assembly, but there's also on the bottom some convenient links, so you can go look at biographies, you can look for contact information, you can find your legislators by searching for who is your legislator for your district, and there's also links to the Constitution, the Century Code, session laws that govern how the legislature holds their session, and administrative rules. There's also a budget information session that they have been updating during the interim, and then when the session starts, they'll be putting new items here as well. The state revenue information, for example, was just updated in October, and it's their monthly, and then they have a quarterly update summary as to how our revenues and our oil and gas tax revenues are going. And at the bottom, they also have agency rules information and several other handy links. Back at the home page, you will see there'll be other links to find my legislators, and then there'll also be a link to the tracking system. There is a legislative tracking system that goes live at the session that you can sign up for, and there's also a handy app that you can go utilize as well. And they are all linked off of this website. So here's the daily schedule. This is the app that they use that you can actually put in what bills you're looking for, and the same with the tracking system. And then there's a legislative bill tracking system that anyone could sign up and use. This is the North Dakota Center for Nursing Advocacy Center. It is located at www.ndcenterfornursing.org/advocacy-center. At the Advocacy Center, you will find our legislative updates every week, which we will have at noon every Friday during the legislative session. And our last interim update is on November 9th. We will post the most current legislative update, usually that Friday morning, which is the soonest that we are able to post it, and also the dial-in information and the Join Me system, so you can follow along on the update during the meeting. The legislative updates always occur at 12 o'clock on Fridays during the session, starting right after the session starts. We will also list our current policy briefs for the session here, and also on this website you can link to other resources such as advocacy FAQs, and at this site you'll see answers to many of your questions and where to find things, how to search for bills, etc. And we also have several other resources linked under this site, and this includes things like advocacy videos that you can download of other nurses to talk about how they have advocated for change, and other resource links to lots of different websites. Stop it. And it's still recording, and I don't know how to stop it. It's still recording, I think. Aha. So for the 2019 legislative deadlines and key dates, what's coming up is an organizational session. So I'm recording this actually the day after Election Day. In November, Kristen actually recorded hers earlier. But all those new representatives and the still in office, the House representatives and senators will get together December 3rd through 5th for an organizational session. Prior to that, there will be a legislative management meeting in which they will look at the reports from all those interim committees and all the bills that were also passed out of those committees to start getting to get organized. And during this session, that's when they pick who's going to be on what committee and get ready. Also, new senators and representatives will go through an orientation. And the governor also, this is when he outlines his budget, because every session the governor works with all of his state agencies to develop what he is proposing as his budget. He also has been working for this session on developing a policy agenda that, from what I understand, is going to be a formal policy agenda, and some of it's going to include nursing workforce information based on a lot of the work we've been doing with the governor's nursing shortage task force. So we're kind of excited because we've never been included in the governor's budget and certainly haven't gotten to this level. So we're looking to December 3rd to 5th to hear more. All the executive agencies, by the way, it's not just legislators actually that can file bills. The agencies can also file bills. So for instance, if the North Dakota Board of Nursing wanted to make a change in the Nurse Practices Act, they could submit it by December 6th, an agency bill. And Supreme Court can do as well. The session begins on January 3rd. There's a State of the State address that day where Governor Burgum gets up and talks about what his priorities are as well. And then you'll see there's deadlines for when people can introduce bills. Representatives can have no more than 5 after a certain date, and then 0 after a certain date. Senators can submit ones at different times. You see I've also highlighted different legislative breakfasts and days for nurses. On January 15th, the North Dakota Nurse Practitioner Association will have their legislative breakfast. There's another deadline there. And then we'll have our Nurses Day at the Legislature on January 23rd. And then there's deadlines for introducing resolutions and amendments and re-referrals of bills. Public Health Day is on February 6th. And the only notice an important date is February 22nd. That's the crossover date for all bills. So all bills must have passed through one side to cross over. Which, by the way, what I didn't discuss is some of the bills that require money would have a fiscal note. And all of those not only have to pass through the committee, they also have to pass through the appropriations committee of those sides. They'll have a very short recess, and then they will reconvene, and then they have to get all the bills and everything done by April 26th because the session is limited to 80 days. This is a map of how the North Dakota State Capitol is set up. You will be entering the doors through 5 or S right there, the south side. There are radar detectors there. And then you will go into the Capitol rooms 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 12. 18, 19, 20 are all hearing rooms for committees, and most of the committees will stay in the same hearing room for the entire duration of the legislative session. Hearing room. And this is a picture of first floor, which is really the floor above the first floor of the entry floor. And this Memorial Hall and Legislative Hall is where exhibits happen all legislative time. I pointed out the nursing days, but pretty much virtually every day somebody is having a day there, and they have booths and they interact with legislators. And this is the entrance into the Senate and the floor rooms. And so in the afternoon, usually 12:30 or 1, which is every day, is when a floor and Senate session happens. And so you can get invited to sit with your legislator in there on the actual hall, or there's a big balcony above it where anyone can go sit during the session. This session, by the way, is also video, live streamed, videoed, and recorded.
Hi, this is Kristen Roars from the North Dakota Nurses Association. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference between testimony and advocacy and how nurses can utilize it to effect change. Testimony and advocacy are two different things. Testimony is your specific action. It's a letter, it's a speech, but that can be part of your advocacy. Advocacy is the overarching act of supporting a cause or a policy. The most common formal advocacy that we engage in at the state level is testimony, and specifically we often think of testimony in front of a legislative committee. In North Dakota, all citizens have a right to testify if they choose to. If you are there representing solely yourself and your opinions, then there really are no rules. If you want to speak on behalf of an organization, then you may need to follow some simple rules. For example, as a registered lobbyist, I can introduce a non-registered person, and then they are speaking on behalf of NDNA. If you are planning to testify before a legislative committee, here are a few things to help you get started. Know the schedule. Get there early, sign in at the lectern as soon as you have a chance. Try to use the time when the committee is on a small break between topics to hand out your testimony, either by handing them directly to the legislators or to the committee clerk. This will decrease some disruption when it is time for you to talk so they can have their attention on you rather than on the paper. If your testimony is part of a coordinated effort, have your different groups be organized. Know who is talking in which order. This helps present a unified and professional front. Do your homework. Does anyone on the committee work in healthcare? Do they serve on a hospital board? Do they have a family member who is a healthcare provider? Is this a rural issue, an urban issue, or a global issue? And what is the makeup of the legislators in front of you? Give them the information in terms that mean something to them, to their constituents. Own your narrative. You are the expert on this topic. In North Dakota, we have citizen legislators, and very few of them understand the inner workings of the healthcare system. So set the tone, set the dialogue. Try to strike a balance between educating them and influencing them. Personal stories are great for emphasis or to illustrate your point, but make sure you can back your testimony up with facts or with direct requests. A sob story alone is not persuasive. Talk about how this particular bill will solve the problem, how inaction will continue to affect patients or nurses or communities. You've done your homework on the legislators, but if you are crafting your message for your own members or constituents or for the media, what do they already know? Do they already have a bias? Do they know you, and why should they care about this? Be clear, be concise, boil it down to what they need to know, keep it simple and easy to understand. How does your issue fit into the bigger picture? Is there any opposition? And if there is, How can you take the wind out of their sails before they have a chance to present their side? Make sure you tell them what you want them to do. All the stories and facts in the world don't help if they don't know what you want them to do at the end of the day. An example would be to end your testimony with, "I encourage you to give this bill a do pass or a do not pass." If you are talking to a legislator outside of committee to help educate them, be prepared to walk and talk. Help them be productive with their limited time between committees. Okay, it's time to get in front of the committee, and here are some etiquette norms that you should be aware of. When you start your testimony, address the chair, the members of the committee, then introduce yourself. So for example, Madam Chair, members of the Human Services Committee, my name is Kristen Rohrs. If you are asked a question by a committee member, prior to providing your answer, again, address the chair, the members of the committee, then answer it. So Mr. Chair, Senator Smith, members of the committee, and then answer the question. This language is hard to get used to, but no one will get mad at you if you mess it up, as long as you make an effort. Involvement in bills at the legislature can take on many different forms, from passively monitoring to actively engaging. Passively monitoring can include things like monitoring just to ensure that nothing goes wrong or changes that you weren't intending. For example, making sure that APRNs are included when appropriate, and actively engaging may be things like testifying or letter writing. Some examples in the 2017 legislative session include when North Dakota Nurses Association was approached by an individual to support a carbon monoxide monitoring bill. We chose to write a letter of support, but not actively get involved in the testimony. Another bill, called the CARE Act by AARP, was one where we have written letters or written testimony in opposition, but didn't devote a lot of time or effort to it. Some examples of bills that the nursing community as a whole have actively engaged in was ensuring that the role of the community paramedic had a clearly defined scope of practice and didn't duplicate services already in place. Co-sponsoring and helping to write workplace violence legislation with the Medical Association, and creating position statements and providing testimony for loan forgiveness programs to benefit high-need areas in nursing. What role do associations play? The goal of advocacy efforts by professional associations is to educate association members, all professional nurses, and the public about the importance of broad-based membership, creative ideas, esprit de corps, and energetic participation in helping the profession improve and move to higher levels. When greater numbers unite in one voice, stronger and more powerful arguments can be advanced to achieve advocacy outcomes. This was from J. Matthews in the Online Journal of Issues in Nursing. Professional organizations like NDNA and NDNPA often take the lead in advocacy and testimony efforts, as the Center for Nursing and Board of Nursing have some restrictions on what they are allowed to do. The Board of Nursing can only propose changes to the Nurse Practice Act, but can be called to testify anytime a nursing practice issue is included in a bill. The Center for Nursing is limited to lobbying on specific topics related to their mission and on any formally developed policy briefs. This leaves professional organizations to be the voice for nursing and to be able to react when things rapidly change in the legislature. And this would be another reason why we would encourage you to join your professional organizations.
So to review the events on Nurses Day at the Legislature, which will be January 23rd, we will have exhibitor setup. We invite all nursing organizations and nursing programs to have a table and sign up as an exhibitor for Nurses Day. The setup is in the Memorial and Legislative Halls, which is where all the legislators go between their floor session, etc. And then we'll also have registration and breakfast in the Heritage Center. We are asking that all of our participants park in the Heritage Center parking lot, which by the way is an advantage. Since we are using the Heritage Center, we get to use that parking lot. Come through the Heritage Center to register to get an overview of the day and breakfast before going over to the Capitol. The Heritage Center is conveniently located right across the street from the Capitol. There will be legislative committee hearings and tours from 9 to 12 at the Capitol that we will have information about the day of the event and really hopefully Friday before the event. There'll be lunch at the Capitol Cafe on your own. We encourage you to contact legislators to eat with them if you would like. And then from 1 to 3 or sometimes 12:30 to 2:30, it's really up to the House and Senate what their schedule is, but they will have floor sessions. You can contact your legislator in advance if you'd like to sit with them on the floor. We will also send out a survey to all our participants to determine who would like to sit on the floor as well, and everyone else will have plenty of room in the balconies on both sides. And then after the various floor sessions, there'll be a meet and greet with the legislators and yogurt parfait fruit cups in the memorial and legislative halls. There is information and the link to register for Nurses Day. Registration is open and live, and the deadline will be in January, shortly before the event. So thank you so much. We are so excited about our Nurses Day that's coming up. Our registration is open and on our website. It's actually it's $10 for students and $30 for nurses to register for the day. And usually, I believe last time we had around 250, 300 there. So certainly we're hoping for more. And it's just an awesome experience to come together as a nursing community to really impact and show our voice. So thank you.